Afternoon. I'm going to call to order the Pierce County Council in Monday study session. The time is 11:01 and all members are present. We are going to start this morning with an agenda. I'm going to ask my colleagues if it is okay, should our sheriff's presenters show up, having them present during other business, having them go first so that we can really dig in and dive into the human services work that's here today. And let them go about their very busy work that they're doing. Not that you all aren't busy, just longer presentation. Okay, hearing no objections, if that works and they're here, we will just flip those two, which brings us to item number 2, which is our legislative update. We'll start with Mr. Taylor.
Yes, good morning. I will be quick because you have a very full study session agenda today. So within your packet are the session briefing materials for week number 5, including our watch list. Mr. Shaw, our state government affairs contractor, is present for his regular Monday briefing to you. So I believe he's going to use that watch list as his primary document for reference, and then of course answer questions members may have.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Shaw.
Good morning. Again, Michael Shaw. Welcome to week 5 already, with only 70 some days to go. They have a little less than 1,700 bills introduced at this point. I think they're going to make 2,000 easy before they're done. We have this week, and then next week on the 21st is the policy committee cutoff. So hopefully it'll slow the rate of bills. There are a lot of bills scheduled for this week. I will just hit some of them because a lot of them are important to Pierce County. First off, today, they're going to exec out the what do they call it? Rent control, lack of a better term, rent control bill 1217. So that's set up for today. And the bill that I keep thinking is going to fall down because it has a fiscal note, but it's 1057. It's the one that gives Department of Commerce the ability to hire more grant writers to help locals tap into federal funds. So that bill just keeps going. So I think I told you in the first week, oh, that bill won't happen. It's a great bill, but it just keeps moving. The more I throw dirt around, the more it keeps going. So I'm going to keep board mouthing it. The big bill is tomorrow. That's the property tax cap lift bill. That's 1334. How should I put this? Again, it raises the property tax cap from 1% to 3%. It's a concept we've seen the last several years. But let me put this caveat out there. I've been talking to the leaders who are leading the revenue discussion in both chambers, and I suspect the bills that they will consider to deal with revenue, we probably won't see till the end of March. They're still having the discussions. They're still trying to figure out which is frankly doable. And what you're going to see this month, you're going to see a bunch of bills introduced that are necessary to make the cuts that were in Governor Inslee's book 1 budget that really wasn't made public, the ones that where they have to do it under the current revenue structure. You're going to start seeing those bills being introduced because they do have to pass and change laws to make the cuts in order to fill the big hole in their budget. And I think that's what you're going to see this month. So you really are not going to see what I refer to as the real revenue bills probably until the end of March. So we'll have this hearing on the property tax in House Finance tomorrow at 8 a.m. Now, there's a couple other bills that are important to Pierce County I wanted to touch on. Dropping down to 5655, which is concerning child care centers, which is the Senate version of the one that Councilmember Denson testified on, and that seems to be moving right along. So I just wanted to bring that out. And also our bill 1650 on airport and REIT flexibility has a hearing coming up on the 13th. And I believe we have a couple council members that plan on attending that hearing and testifying on that. Our county ferry bill is sitting on the House floor waiting for a vote. Hopefully it'll be on the consent calendar. That's the calendar they do when they're having their morning coffee, and it's usually because they're all unanimous, and hopefully we'll get that out and moved along this week. So those are the highlights that I've hit. There's a bunch of other bills. Frankly, my tracker is just getting bigger and bigger. It's 50, almost 60 pages. But I just want to give you the highlights at this point. Again, I guess if I were to leave you with anything, we're moving from policy bills to talk, well, you're starting to feel the shadow of the budget, frankly, being felt. And we're going to be focusing more and more on the fiscal committees, because after the 21st, they have a week where the fiscal committees will start churning through. And you're starting to find out that fiscal notes do mean something. And a lot of these bills, I don't think will make it much past that. I think leadership is really starting to push on their members to show a little restraint and to be cognizant of the fact they still have a $12 billion hole that they have to deal with. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the update and the work you do. I'll look to my colleagues to see if anyone has a question this morning. I'm not seeing any, so thank you, Mr. Shaw, for the work you're doing. And everybody knows how to get a hold of you to follow up if there's something specific for their district or community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to item number 3, which is review of this week's council meeting agenda. Ms. Long.
Right, thank you and good morning. This is your regular council meeting agenda for tomorrow. It is amended. So we'll start with your consent agenda under section 5. You have a few items for introduction and scheduling tomorrow. The first of those is 2025-503. This is granting the South Fork Estates Homeowners Association a non-exclusive franchise for a sewer pipeline system. This is for referral to rules, and you'll be setting the final on this for March 18th. Next is 2025-505. This is granting a non-exclusive franchise to Puget Sound Energy for the location of electric lines. This is for referral to rules, and you'll be setting the final on this for March 11th. Next is 2025-506. This is declaring certain county-owned personal property, used equipment. This is an excavator owned by the Public Works Department. Equipment revolving and rental fund to be surplus and authorizing the sale thereof. This is for referral to rules, and you'll be setting the final on this one for March 11th. Under resolutions for scheduling, you have our 2025-102, and this is granting the executive the authority to enter into an interlocal agreement between the county and the city of Ording for the provision of specialized law enforcement services. This is for referral to rules, and you'll be setting the final on this for March 4th. You have one item under grants, and that is pending review during this study session this morning. That's the Funfield Hangar Electrical Rehabilitation, Federal Aviation Administration. And that was from Planning and Public Works, and Mr. Boki will speak to you in more detail about that shortly. So you have no proclamations tomorrow. Under section 8 resolutions, you have one item, and that's our 2024-253. And that is accepting the 2024 Affordable Rental Housing NOFA funding recommendations and approving certain expenditures. This received a due pass at Health and Human Services on February 4th. And then finally, under ordinances, you have 2025-502, and this is canceling certain uncollectible personal property taxes. This received a due pass at rules on February 3rd, and those are your agenda items for tomorrow afternoon's regular council meeting.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Seeing none, we will move on to the, there are no amendments, so grant reports.
Thank you, Chair Hitch and Paul Boki, council staff. The grant that you will be seeing tomorrow is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Federal Aviation Administration $285,000 grant request for the construction and construction administration of hangar electrical upgrades at Thun Field. The hangar electrical upgrades will include upgrades to hangars A, B, C, and E, and replace the interior wiring receptacles and interior and exterior lighting. The project will improve the safety of the airport tenants, preserve the life of the hangars, and allow the hangars to become useful revenue-generating hangars once again by upgrading the failing electrical system. This is a $285,000 grant. It runs for 4 years. The match on that is $15,000. That will come from the airport fund, Fund 460. And I believe there is a representative on the line from Planning and Public Works. Not sure.
You looking for?
Like
Ayla Nelson.
Shayla Nelson, or I had another individual too, but I don't have the name now.
Well, let's see if there's any questions that would require someone, and then maybe they'll ping, so. Councilmember Morrell.
No questions, just a comment. This is part of the challenge that we face with these airports that we have gotten, both Narrows and Thunfield. Thunfield was a privately owned airport. That these hangars were built in the 1950s. And I'm not going to say that they were up to standards, especially the electrical part of it. But we've had failures of the system over the last 6 or 7 years. Counties had to repair those at a tune of about $10,000 every time a hangar goes down. So we need to resolve this issue, and this seems to be the best way forward. I'm hoping that we have the match money. And this is one of the issues that we need to address in the House Bill 1650 to try and give the county flexibility to use the REIT tax for these kind of matches that we cannot afford to finance on our own through the enterprise funds that these airports have to operate under. So there again, I think this is a good pathway forward. I'm glad the FAA acknowledges that. So thank you for allowing me to comment, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the comments and the work to continue improving our airports. Any other questions for staff? Any objections to having this on our consent agenda? Okay, thank you, Mr. Belkey. That brings us to number 4, which is review of committee agendas for the week. Ms. Long.
All right, thank you. So this afternoon at 1:30, you do have a Public Safety Committee meeting. There you have on your agenda, Pierce County inclement weather updates. That will be with Interim Director Amy Gillespie from Emergency Management. And then you have a 2025 Public Safety Committee draft work plan discussion. Tomorrow, February 11th, beginning at 9:30, you have an Economic and Infrastructure Development Committee meeting. You have 3 proposals on that agenda and 3 discussion items. First of the proposals is O 2025-500. This is granting a supplemental franchise number 1 to the OHOP Mutual Light Company for the location of power lines. This has a February 25th final hearing date. Next is O 2025-501. This is granting non-exclusive franchise to the Shore Acres Water Company for the location of water lines. And this has a February 18th final hearing date. And the third proposal is O 2025-504. This is vacating a portion of 154th Street Northwest. And this has a March 4th final hearing date. Next on your agenda is the 2024 committee work review. And then you have the 2025 draft committee work plan discussion. And then finally, under other business, you have airport updates, and that will be with Jeff Campbell from Planning and Public Works. At noon tomorrow is your regular Tuesday study session with just your usual agenda items there. However, there's one addition under other business, and that is an overview of the charter review process. At 3 p.m. tomorrow is your regular council meeting. One more item for this week is on Friday, February 14th, beginning at 9 a.m. You have a special meeting of the Rules and Operations Committee, and that is on your agenda. You have executive session pursuant to RCW 4230-110-1G. This is basically to consider the qualifications for applicants for public employment, and then a discussion of next steps. And those are your meetings for the remainder of this week.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions from my colleagues on the meeting schedule? Okay. Seeing none, there's no amendments, so we can go to number 5, Mr. Taylor. Any Anything
Thank
from
you.
you?
So council members, in the interest of time this morning, and I had a conversation with the chair about this morning. I'm going to hold my administrative items until Tuesday's study session tomorrow. That'll give you plenty of time to deal with some other items on your agenda today.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That brings us to number 6, which is going to take the bulk of our meeting this morning. We have 2 presentations, one on the Human Services Procurement Improvement Report. And then second is a sheriff's office position conversion and closure. And we're going to start with item B with the sheriff's department. So Mr. Boki, I'm going to have you TSF, and then we've got our sheriff staff in the audience here to answer any questions and share their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hitchin, Paul Boki, council staff. The budget ordinance has 2 sections in it. One, section 14, provides the department shall neither employ nor authorize the employment of a person beyond the designated number within a fund or department without prior council approval by resolution or ordinance. And then there's also a section 16 that provides that position conversions in sheriff law enforcement and sheriff corrections shall not become effective until a notification of the position change has been received by the county council, and that the county council has approved the position change by motion through its consent agenda. So the resolution that will be before you and that's going to be discussed this morning is dealing with both those sections. And so you have in Exhibit A to that resolution shows that there's going to be several things happen. So in corrections, a correctional captain's position will be changed to correctional major. And there's a small fiscal note to that, an increase. Then the correctional captain, one of the 2 correctional captain positions will be eliminated. And you see the budget savings there of $230,910. So the net impact of this is that the sheriff corrections in the general fund will actually save some money. In sheriff law enforcement, the bureau chief is being proposed to being changed to a major. And that's a upgrade in the amount of dollar amount in that. And so the impact is negative in that case. A captain will be changed to a major position. And then there'll be a new major position added, and that is in the towards the bottom there. So that is an additional position. That is an additional FTE, and the cost of that, the annual fiscal impact on that, is estimated to be $221,650. So the total impact in the general fund is de minimis. It's below $5,000. The law enforcement side will need to find about $4,650 according to this. That shouldn't be an issue in a large budget like that in that department. So Under Sheriff Ferrardo is here to speak to this resolution and talk about that and answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Boki. Under Sheriff Fajardo?
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the council. Cindy Fajardo, Under Sheriff for the Pierce County Sheriff's Office. I'm a little shorter than you. Thank you. When we took over the office on January 1st, actually before then, we did a deep dive into the organization and how it was structured. And the hope was to make improvements on 2 fronts. One was to establish a succession planning, so we would have 2 deep of anyone with knowledge in the department. One of the challenges we found when we took over in January was that when the old administration left, so did all the knowledge. And so it was like rebuilding over and over again. And as we go forward, we want there to be more a cohesive type of management within the sheriff's office. This also gives a little bit more one-on-one opportunity for management of programs, contact with the community, some more diversity within the ranks, and some more opportunities for professional growth for people who we want to take over or who should take over in the future of the department. So when we started the restructure, we looked at the varying departments, divisions, and how it could operate better and what would be more streamlined to make decisions, to operate better, and to get the results that we need to make the office what it needs to be, which is running effectively, running efficiently, and having some variety within the management ranks. So when we sat down with both the corrections people who we chose to be in corrections as their managers and also on the law enforcement side. And so this is the plan that we would like to look at and to initiate. And we tossed around a number of different versions, and this is the one we landed on. I think it's very important to note that we were very cognizant of not wanting to cost the county any money. Our entire plan on this was what can we do to save the county money? And although we weren't able to have it as a net zero, it's $4,600, which we can easily make up with salary savings. And the end result is that you get better supervision, better direct supervision, and more direct ability for people to control each division they have, and also have the ability to make command decisions at each one of those levels. So we don't have this time delay of having to ask mom and dad permission before they can go forward on routinely operational issues. And so far, so good. 41 days into it, it's working very well. We did get permission from Human Resources to put those people temporarily in those positions, so we could keep moving the machine going while this came to council for their review and for their approval. And we're very proud of how this is working out, and we're seeing the results that we hope to see, where it's collaborative operation more than a siloed organization. So I would be happy to entertain any concerns or questions that council may have.
Thank you very much for coming up in person and talking us through this. I'm going to look to Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
I have a few questions pertaining to, and I appreciate your comment of wanting to save money. Great, but I think the public's more interested in the positive aspects of this. Can you kind of explain what, if the public will see any benefit from this reorganization?
Well, I think they've seen it already without being prompted by command staff on the patrol side. Our patrol majors took the initiative and organized some traffic emphases this weekend on Canyon Road to address the speed and negligent driving on that. And so by them being enabled to make those command decisions and enact programs, I know my phone blew up this weekend with people commenting on the positive results that they've seen. So again, we're only 41 days into this, and we're already making some endways in how the public views us and sees us, and the visibility of it all. And I think you are all very well aware of the issues on Canyon Road.
Thank you for that answer. Also, the other follow-up question is, in taking these captain positions and converting them to a major position, does that leave any captains in the organization?
No, that actually essentially would remove the captain rank from our office, and the captain rank would no longer exist.
Okay, because if I remember right, the captains kind of did their own bargaining.
They did. They were an association, and we did meet with HR and have discussions jointly with the two captains, well, the one captain that was left, and what the future of the captain rank would be. We involved the county legal, and when it was all said and done, it was determined by the two people who had the rank of captain that they wanted to move on to the major, and one is actually a chief. And so by them leaving those two positions and our wanting to eliminate that rank, it ceased to exist from now on.
Okay, and not that you have a crystal ball, but I would assume at some point your majors will look at collective bargaining also.
Well, they do have the right to do that, but of course, you know, it's a long process involving PERC and county HR for that to occur.
Okay, just like I say, looking towards the future. The other comment that I just want to make sure of is the impact on corrections. This is not going to negatively impact corrections, is it?
No, when we reviewed exactly what the major was doing as far as job title and on the two captains positions, there was a redundancy, but not a succession. So with the difference in ranks, there was some redundancy of a major actually doing some captain's work and vice versa. But this streamlines everything, where there's clearly two reporting avenues, one for the new jail, one for the old jail. And so people know what that looks like. It also gives the chief a little bit more ability to appoint acting chiefs when he is not around. So they also get that knowledge and experience in what it's like to have the leadership role of the jail. If I could go back to the question you had about the major positions, even if they were to organize labor, they still are appointed by the sheriff. So they still would be a sheriff's appointee, an at-will employee.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then just so there's a broad understanding of the new members on this council, when we rewrote in section 16 that the sheriff's department had to come before this council and explain kind of any reorganization, in my opinion, being the one who wrote that proviso language, we were in the middle of a biennial budget. We were obviously looking at some unknowns coming in, and we just wanted to make sure that the process was respected and the process was followed through. There was no animosities or any trying to box the sheriff's department in. We just wanted a representative from the sheriff's department to come and explain if they were going to make any changes. That was it. I don't think there's any council member on this council that doesn't want Sheriff Swank to succeed and the organization to succeed, because Lord knows we need law enforcement. We need it carried out in this county. It's probably one of the number one priorities that we have as a county government. So with that, I'm glad that you put this together, your organization. It seems to be a sensible restructure, and I have no problem with it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the questions and comments. And I do have Councilmember Krueger like to ask some questions or speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say also congratulations and appreciate your hard work on this. And I wanted to point out that I did have a deputy approach me at an event and comment how he's glad to stay on, and because he was seeing the changes and they were positive and were offering more opportunities to progress and expand the horizons. And I was real grateful to hear that. And then just this morning, I met with a constituent in the Frederickson area, and they're like, oh my gosh, there was, I want to say help, or there was enforcement going on along Canyon and Frederickson, and they were very grateful because it's, as we know, it's gotten a little crazy. So I appreciate the out of the box thinking, and seeing this come to fruition is very enlightening and welcomed. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you
Chair.
very much.
Thank you very much. And I'll echo the comments of my colleagues and appreciate the questions you asked, Councilmember Morrell, and the work that you did to put this together. So this will be on our agenda next week. If anyone has additional questions, they know how to get a hold of you. But thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon to make sure we were all on the same page.
Thank you for your time, and we do look forward to working with you in the future. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, that brings us to the item I quickly passed over because I want to make sure that we have time to really dig in. Many of us have been working on this for quite a while. We're going to start with Mr. Vetter to kind of introduce. Carrie Waterland is in the audience to provide support, but we're going to have Mr. Vetter start us off.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the council. This study of Pierce County's procurement and contract approval process for contracts administered by the Human Services Department was authorized by the council in the 2024-2025 biennial budget. After a standard procurement process, the council contracted with Partners in Public Innovation, or PPI, out of Sacramento to conduct the study. PPI specializes in process improvements for cities and counties, and Ryan Hunter and Lauren Dodge of PPI are here to present the report today. Before I turn it over to them, I just wanted to thank Human Services and Finance staff and the representatives from the providers who are great partners in this project, and the work you will see here reflects the effort that those staff put in. So if I can turn it over to Ryan Hunter.
Good morning. Thank you, Bill. It's good to be with you all this morning. Is somebody on Pierce's end sharing their presentation? Great.
They are about to, and if you just say next slide, they'll move us through.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. So I'm excited to share with you the work that the improvement team has done for the last few months. Let's go to the next slide. A few slides here just to set the context. So I think, as you all know, Human Services contract numbers have been growing over the last few years, especially out of the pandemic, both in terms of number of contracts and in terms of the dollar value of those contracts. Let's go to the next slide. As we began this work, we thought about why is change needed in this process. As you all know, as contract volume has increased, so has the pressure on Human Services. The volume of work for Human Services program staff increased significantly. At the same time, so has the length of procurements. So with the increasing pressure on that system, there have been some major errors that have occurred. Those errors have led to increased scrutiny. That increased scrutiny also slows the process down more, which leads to more delays. And in some instances, the county has had contracts expire without renewals in place, and has had to authorize emergency contracts. On the provider side, some of those providers have had to provide services for months without reimbursement or without any guarantee that they'll be funded for the work. So all of this becomes a vicious cycle. Let's go to the next slide. This work comes kind of from a foundation of some work from the last several years. So there was a 2019 evaluation of Human Services business process. There was a progress report a couple of years ago. And then, as Bill said, we began this work in kind of mid to late 2024. Go to the next slide. And again, I just wanted to highlight that Human Services has been doing process improvement work leading up to this. This has some summary of the improvement work that Human Services has been engaged in. For example, they developed a set of standard contract templates for the most common contract types. So we came in kind of in from the foundation of that existing work that had been done. Go to the next slide, and I think Lauren's taking this piece.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So for this round of improvements, PPI got to engage the Human Services team more directly. First, we convened an improvement team with a variety of people from Human Services as well as Pierce County procurement. We scoped the procurement process, where we would start, where we would finish, identified problem areas, we ideated solutions, and then we created a series of both immediate as well as midterm next steps. Next slide, please. The improvement team consisted of our project sponsors, which had representation from the council, including Carrie Waterland and Bill Vetter. We also had leadership from Human Services, having Chris Cooley on the sponsor team. The improvement team included finance as well as Human Services division and fiscal staff and community providers. Finally, PPI facilitators were both Ryan and myself, as well as Ratna and Min. Next slide, please. So one of the first steps that we did was launch a Voice of the Consumer workshop. So PPI does Voice of the Consumers workshops in order to identify customer needs and expectations, to get improvement teams to be face-to-face with these end users in order to help build empathy, not just from Human Services and peers with the providers, but also for providers in return. This helps us to identify problems that the customers might be experiencing and to see it from their point of the process and to hopefully enhance customer satisfaction and loyalty. So here are a variety of quotes that we heard from this improvement or this Voice of the Consumer workshop. Most importantly, the takeaway is that these problems with contracting have resulted in emergency council actions, major impacts on community providers, and ultimately this threatens the services that Pierce is trying to provide. And so I think this is at the heart of why we're trying to create process improvement within human services and why the human services staff is so committed to making these changes. Next slide, please, and then back to Ryan.
Thanks, Lauren. So we worked with the improvement team to estimate the timeline for the current state of running a procurement. So this is a really simplified version of the procurement timeline for a human services contract that requires council approval. As you can see, this is about 11 months from the time when the procurement has begun being drafted until the time when contracts are actually executed and can start. This timeline we estimated from a combination of looking at 6 specific recent contracts and from the estimates of timelines from the folks on the improvement team. Let's go to the next slide. You can see here the actual process maps that the improvement team built live in the workshops. And I do just want to emphasize that all of the work that you're seeing, the process maps, the timelines, all of the obstacle areas and solution areas that we're about to share were really things that came collaboratively from the work of the group. So they really represent the best thinking of the human services staff and community providers and finance and council staff who were a part of the improvement team. So they mapped the improvement process and identified some key obstacles. Let's go to the next slide. And we have been thinking about those obstacles in sort of 4 large buckets. So the errors in RFPs that have resulted in increased oversight, the many approval processes that are necessary for an RFP that are happening serially, that is one after the other, different county departments and human services divisions that are not working together in a standardized process, and then insurance requirements were a thing that we heard over and over again. Let's go to the next slide. So to take these in turn, so errors in RFPs. We heard a lot about concerns about how solicitations had been built. So some of that had to do with unclear definitions, sort of confusion about locations of where providers are based versus where money is going to be spent, scoring methods that weren't understandable or transparent, and discrepancies in how the proposals have been scored versus council's expectations about that scoring. A lot of that, the sort of root causes of these issues had to do with the tasks that we've given human services program staff. Writing and designing RFPs is a highly technical task. Folks in human services are doing this a few times a year, and they do incredible hard work on those solicitations, but it's also not what we've traditionally hired for or trained for. Some divisions are doing this in a stronger way than others, but there's too much sort of siloing and lack of standardization to have great broad learning across human services from one another. So I think the question we were tackling is, how do we set up human services to build higher quality solicitations in the first place so that we can reverse that vicious cycle, clean up those errors, and then get to a point where we feel better about actually having less oversight. Go to the next slide, and Lauren.
Yeah, so over the next handful of slides, Ryan and I are going to transition where he will introduce an obstacle and I'll introduce the solutions that were generated. To reiterate Ryan's point, these solutions were not generated by PPI exclusively. These solutions were generated with the improvement team. So this is having eyes from both Human Services Council and Finance, thinking through what solutions are going to be most effective for tackling the identified obstacles. So this first set of solutions is like a 3-pronged approach. First is creating a liaison role. And this is going to help identify where the issues are occurring, as well as solutions that council is looking for and that human services deems appropriate. This would include establishing a checklist of what council needs from various documents coming to them, identifying issues and council concerns early and proactively in the procurement process, identifying council sponsors early, perhaps utilizing one person at Human Services to write resolutions. This is not writing all RFPs. This is writing things that are going to council. In part, this would help to reduce the amount of effort that we are putting in front of council on a routine basis. So what you can see over to the side is Human Services start at identifying how to make their stories more convincing and how to reduce the mental load of all these documents coming to council so that the story is being told more effectively. Next slide, please. All right, this next part of the solution is to beef up the training within Human Services staff, as well as break down silos. So the core of this opportunity is that we can allow Human Services and procurement to talk more routinely about the experience and practices that have been valuable or that need work. Again, cross divisions, work is being done very differently within Human Services, with some divisions having more strong work than others. They can take these learnings and teach to other Human Services divisions to help raise the entire quality of work coming out. Some of the work that might help here would be to conduct Human Services staff skills assessment, routine trainings on RFPs, contract writing and resolution writing, continued education for staff around insurance invoicing, especially during contract amendments, and then creating standard communication rollout across and updates across all Human Services divisions. The image over to the side is an example of a regular communication practice that PPI uses internally, as well as with many of our clients, called the huddle. And this would allow divisions to have more routine and less siloed communication plans. Next slide, please. Finally, creating updated standards of practice. So something that would be really beneficial is to create or is to update RFP as well as contract standards across all divisions that match the end format. As updates happen, they get rolled out through Human Services differently. And so using standards across the department will help to standardize this practice and increase the quality. We can also test these rollouts for comprehension and effectiveness and iterate continually to improve. Some examples that are currently being used are the RFP intake template for OpenGov, as well as various contract templates. Next slide, please.
Another category of obstacles that we heard was the way that finance, procurement, risk, and different Human Services divisions are not operating together in a standard way. But this came out in a few different ways. So we heard often from providers that they were being asked to either provide the same document to multiple Pierce departments or multiple Human Services divisions when they were applying for more than one funding category, or even that they were given conflicting information from different people in the county. So the county was not sort of speaking with one unified voice to those providers. And I think what you might say overall, right, was that divisions are making the best choices they know how to make in order to sort of optimize for them and what makes sense for them, but without a great view into how that affects the entire system of Human Services procurement. Let's go to the next slide.
I'm on mute, sorry. The proposed solution for this obstacle would be to create standards to improve the provider experience. So for instance, we could create an internal document sharing policy within Pierce County. This is something that's currently being worked towards. Providers would be able to share the same documentation one time across all Pierce County departments for a single RFP. This would allow providers who are submitting multiple applications for the same RFP to submit only one set of required documents. This reduces the redundancy and possible errors that the provider may make. So insurance is a great example of this. The provider is awarded funds, and part of the award letter includes the requirement that they must submit their insurance documents. Human Services right now does not have a universal repository, and so the provider has to submit the same insurance documents to each division during the contract negotiation and when it expires. So an organization like Comprehensive Life Resources may have 10 or more contracts in Human Services with 4 different divisions. So each division is asking for the same insurance document, and this creates a lot of extra work for a provider. Next slide, please.
Thank you. And I want to also highlight that to the point about different divisions working differently, the huddle tool that we referenced earlier is also about breaking down silos between those divisions so that they have better transparency into lessons learned among one another. So to address these approval processes that happen serially, you can see in this slide that so this is showing just the piece of the process from when the RFP closes until council, as this is assuming a contract that has gone to council, until council has fully approved, is over 180 days. So that's half a year from on, roughly on average from when we're closing an RFP to when we've made final approval of what the funding recommendations are. If that sounds like a long time, I think it should. I want to really highlight that the Human Services staff who are in the midst of this process are doing quite heroic work, in fact, to move these solicitations forward in the process. But some of what this looks like on the ground is that, okay, person A, B, C, D, E, F, and G all need to approve. And right now we are pushing these things forward. So person A is going to hold on to it until it is sort of fully vetted and approved, and move it on to person B, who will hold on to it until it is sort of perfect and fully vetted and approved, and move it on to person C. And of course, the more this process has had errors and problems, the more we add people to that process, and the more pressure is on each one of those people to make sure that it's perfect before they move it on. So the challenge here, I think, is to say, well, the only way is to sort of shorten this timeline. And by the way, the longer this timeline is, the bigger problems we have with contracts expiring, or things like templates changing before we reach the contract execution stage. The only real ways to deal with this are to either remove layers of approval or to have these layers of approval happen concurrently. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, so this slide is really going to be talking about like the biggest time-saving opportunity within the solution slides. And what this is going to hinge on is, one, increasing the quality of materials that are coming through Human Services and to council, but also creating a lot more efficiencies within Human Services in order to help the internal timeline speed up as well. So the goal is to have the council agenda drive the timeline. So once the RFP closes, the goal would be to set a date for when the documents go to council. And rather than work slowly pushing this timeline out, instead, this becomes the date that Human Services needs to drive towards in order to meet the tighter timeline. Some ways that we can help achieve this would be to work with council in order to, one, potential committee that meets a little bit more routinely, so that there's more flexibility in choosing what that deadline is. And then a handful of other more detailed steps around AEC committee reviews and Human Services exec approvals. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll get into that. So first step would be to change how the AEC standards work across Human Services. Creating standard policies and procedures will help to make this process a lot more predictable and routine within Human Services. Right now, divisions are doing things a little bit differently, with some standing out. We can use those standout divisions in order to help create the standards throughout the department. So for instance, we can create standard committee selection criteria, as well as the scoring process. If Human Services works with council early on, we can start to increase the transparency of these selections as well as involve council in what should be included in the scoring process more early on in order to help meet outcomes. Human Services can also utilize standard training for scorers, as well as standard scoring rubrics and practices. Next slide, please. The next portion, or the next part of this solution would be to, again, commit to a date that these things will be approved, and then Human Services leadership helping to meet that deadline by faster internal approvals. We will need to increase the quality and trust in order to reduce these timelines. Human Services leadership, like the number of leadership approval should be reduced to 1 person within Human Services leadership. They would benefit from having a checklist of needs of things that should go to council and trying to make this list as short as possible. Content can be provided to leadership 1 week before the meeting for faster approval timelines, and then creating a template for monthly council letters that just requires updating rather than from scratch creation. Next slide, please. Finally, the final piece of this, like currently serial, but in the future concurrent timeline, would be to try to reduce the amount of time that is spent during contract negotiation. This proposed solution for this would be to create a letter to notify providers that they are recommended for funding pre-council approval. Human Services can send these letters to the providers as soon as Human Services submits their final approval to council with proper documentation and language that says that provided that council approves this award, they need to be prepared to expedite, or they need to prepare the following to expedite contract negotiations. This would all need to be approved and reviewed by your PA, but this would allow providers extra time to research insurance before contract negotiation. We think it's also important to note that once these documents get onto council agenda, providers are paying attention for when their documents are being seen by the county. So they're aware when they are up for recommendation as soon as it hits the agenda. Not notifying them ahead of time just further slows down the process, potentially by twice as long as it needs to be. Next slide, please.
So we heard a lot from providers and staff about insurance requirements. We heard from providers who said that there were too many or too difficult insurance requirements, that it was hard for them even to get an insurance provider to provide that level of insurance, or that it was prohibitively expensive. We heard, again, sort of conflicting, that providers were getting conflicting information about what insurance was required, and a lot of questions about whether they had to pass on insurance requirements to subcontractors, and if so, whether that was even practical for them to do for certain kinds of subcontracted work. Next slide.
So the proposed solution here is to communicate insurance requirements clearly to Human Services and providers, especially on a more routine basis. We would like to expand Risk's practice of sitting with Human Services in a meeting to review all insurance requirements for all contracts within every division at one time. As Ryan said, these are currently happening sort of in a back and forth style that takes a long time and adds to confusion. With insurance changing nationally and becoming more complicated, having an expert like Risk sit with Human Services and go through these insurance recommendations would really help to expedite this process, as well as to create a more informed contracting unit. So this has actually already been tested. Risk sat down with Human Services and Finance with the PSTAA group, and within a 2-hour meeting, they were able to identify all insurance requirements. A process that normally takes days took just 2 hours. This practice could be expanded out and practiced throughout the Human Services Department until we can get to a point where this becomes a little bit more routine and less cumbersome for providers as well as Human Services staff. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Lauren. And there's some more sort of medium-term insurance recommendations in a minute. So finally, there's to address the last piece of the process, which is the sort of final contract approval and execution. Something that came up frequently was that Human Services is relying on Workday, which is a financial management system, rather than a purpose-built contract management system in order to do that final contract execution. That's been problematic because it's not really built to handle something like a revision to like a small revision to a contract. The way it's currently operating is as with a financial approval, that any revision sends every approval all the way back to the beginning of the queue, and everyone has to prove it all over again, which is more appropriate for financial transactions and less appropriate for contracting. Next slide.
Right, so the solution would be to create or to get a dedicated contract management system. This solution is actually already being looked into by Human Services with secured funds for 2026 and 2027 budget. This is definitely a best practice for implementation, but we just want to point out that this is not the primary driver of quality or of the timeliness issue. Currently, the Workday process takes approximately 24 days. With a dedicated contract management system or tool, this could cut the time in half to 12 days. Next slide, please.
So this is the punchline. The team thinks that if they could implement all of the changes that we've talked about, that you would be able to sort of roughly cut in half the amount of time that it takes to run a procurement. So to cut about 5 months off of the time to procure a contract. And that's largely coming from the changes in timeline that we talked about in terms of making those approvals happen in a tighter, more concurrent way. Go to the next slide. So for implementation, let's skip this one. Thank you. So for implementation, there are some short-term implementation steps that the improvement team is already working on. They established a number of subgroups to kind of carry forward the immediate next steps from the improvement workshops. Let's go to the next slide. But these are a few of the pieces that I think are sort of out of scope of what the current team is able to handle internally that we wanted to highlight. So additional support that would be needed for further implementation. So project management structure for scoring and approvals. So, to really achieve that shortened timeline that we're talking about, it really means that you have to sort of proactively manage the schedule for approval. And I think Human Services will need help to sort of create a standardized way of doing that. So what's the checklist that we need in order to get this thing through to the oversight committee that needs to approve it, and then through to Human Services leadership and to the executive, and then to the council if it's a council approved contract. So the checklist schedules, Gantt charts to have a more project management oriented way of doing that. And related to that, some standardized ways of building the sort of standing council presentation to be able to bring these reports to you all in a way that is timely and less labor intensive for Human Services staff. And that some of that's about supporting the new liaison role to be able to do that in a clean way, and that it is also still satisfying to council. We talked about the sort of new standards for that would make sort of scoring and approval easier. So those standards need to be created, but then tested and evaluated, and iterative improvement made on those so that they are happening cleanly and you get the error reduction that you're wanting. We talked about standing up that huddle, which I think would be a major tool, making sure that Human Services divisions are all learning from one another and doing things in a standard way. And finally, around the insurance requirements, There was kind of a number of deeper dives that we would have liked to do that were just out of the scope of this work. So some benchmarking work to see, are your insurance requirements in line with your peers and in line with best practices? Are there insurance requirements that you could reasonably reduce? Are there innovative practices out there where you could either pool risk or reduce cost? And sort of regardless of the answers to those questions, what's the most effective way to communicate those requirements earlier and more easily to everyone involved? And finally, any solicitation support for procuring and implementing your new contract management system. All right, we can go to the last slide. That's our presentation. So we're happy to talk to you more, take questions.
Thank you, Ryan and Lauren, for all the work you did. The breadth is impressive, and I really think you have some very specific solutions in there. So I'll look to my colleagues to see if we have questions, and then I would like to hear from both Human Services staff and some of our community members that were part of this work, just to see their reflections on what's come out of this and other questions they might have. Does anyone have questions? Councilmember Denson.
Thank you, Chair. And the department may be addressing this, but my question is next steps. How are we deciding which of these strategies are going to be employed? It sounds like a few of them are already being worked on, and what's the timeline for that? And that's certainly some great ideas in here. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Murray.
Good morning, Julie Murray. I am Executive Counsel with Executive Mello's office. And I'm here today, to emphasize this is an important issue to the executive and one that we're going to be working on. I think there's two improvements that have happened rather recently. The first is, you may be aware, we do have more of a dedicated DPA now to help us with procurement issues. You've met him, Jonathan Salamis. And so we have him, and we also have a person who'll be coming on board March 3rd, Bonnie Lindstrom, who has a history in contracts and procurements. She's coming to us from the Office of Financial Management and had worked prior to that at Department of Social and Health Services on their contracts, their centralized contracts unit. And she's going to come on board. And I think what we're going to just have to do is spend some time unpacking the breadth of this study. There are some, like I said, there's some short-term things we can do. Now we have this dedicated help, so there is a resource for Human Services when they have questions to be able to get some more immediate answers. When you look at something like the insurance requirements, risk management is very open to like working on trying to make a more standardized system, make it more apparent to the people in the RFP process what's going to be required of them. And helping them with resources. But I think there are just some things that we're going to have to both review, because this study is a study of like the current environment. And so maybe I have a more radical perspective of it, which is, do we have the right tools to do these procurements? I think that even the prior administration would say that post, and I call it procurement wars in the office. You remember I came on in July of 2023. And when we had the advice from the DPAs that our charter requires this kind of very rigid competitive process, or not actually, I would say the code requires a more rigid process, but the charter requires that services be done through a competitive process. That is something unique to Pierce County. I don't know if people really recognize that is not a state law requirement. That is not one required within other, counties, cities, other jurisdictions. It's one that is unique to Pierce County. And so we're kind of trying to build a system. If you're just using the current RFP process that's in code, that's really built for, buying gravel, buying pavement, where you're looking at a very generalized sort of good or, material that you can do a very easy, simple comparison across the board. Whereas when you go into the service area, people are maybe trying to get to the same result, but doing the services very differently. And how do you actually build an RFP that can adequately assess the value of each proposal in a more apples to apples environment. That may be too hard to do. And so the council did try and put together the notice of funding availability process. And I think that's one that we're really going to look at quite a bit to say, is there a way we can even improve upon that and use it more frequently? Because as you are all aware, under the normal RFP process coming to council, you have a binary decision. It's, do you approve it or do you implode the RFP? And if that's the process we're going to continue, I would pose the question to you of, is this something that necessarily needs to come to council? I think a lot of the processes also you have in place and expectations were built on the idea that you could change the list, that you had, you could move around and make different selections. And if you can't do that, if you want to eliminate 60 days from this process, then maybe you eliminate having these come here for approval. And I know that maybe we're, again, pretty radical, but it is, as you could see, a large time frame. And is there really the desire to decide at the end of this long process to essentially implode it and start again? We really shouldn't get there. Where we need, I think, the most input from the council is as we're putting together the RFP, as we're looking at what are we trying to procure and how are we going to try to measure that's where you can really add value. I'm not necessarily sure it's at the end of the process unless you have a role in sort of changing the awards. And so that's just something to look at in the NOFA process, is maybe there are a role for certain, types of procurements where if you have the ability to change that list, that it does come before council. So I think we have to sort of look at it as like, what's the system we're going to build, and not necessarily, there are good things that have come from this that we think about in building a better process. But I'm not necessarily sure I'm quite as wedded to staying with the current process.
Thank you for that. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, there's so much in this. But what I heard from the consultants initially about making sure we have someone who really understands how to write an RFP, that RFPs are very complicated. They may look simple when it comes out, but it's one of those things that has to be done just right. And when it's not done correctly, then you go through months and months of a process and then have to start over again. So I'm excited that you've got the dedicated DPA and then this individual coming from OPM, and hopefully we can make sure that the RFPs are correct and are going to produce applications that are as easy as possible, knowing that services are not always apples to apples, but at least we've tried to simplify it as much as possible so that human services staff can make decisions.
Yeah, and I think what also, and I think it was highlighted in the report, is that I think we did a lot of work, and I'll use we with me because it was during that time here at the council, to really learn this system. And I'm not necessarily sure that there was enough adequate training that happened to live in this new world. We also had a number of RFPs sort of in the pipeline, right, that hadn't really gone through that sort of system. So I think there really is a good training opportunity here. And I do believe it'll be more of, I think, hopefully a Scott Nicholson task to talk about, well, where are the places where we are not working between departments consistently, so that these become more pro forma. Because my hope is that we can get these procurements and have you have enough understanding on the front end that you'll actually find and ask, as I do to a lot of contracts I have to sign, what's the value add I have here? And if I don't, then we can just move forward, just move them out, right? But we're not there yet, and we're going to work on getting there. So.
Thank you for the questions. Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's nice to see you, Ms. Murray. But to follow up on the questions and to kind of answer your question pertaining to the charter, understand the historical aspect of how we became a charter county versus a commissioner-run county is because of government corruption within the system. And not only our auditor, but our sheriff also. So I imagine that that may have been written in there to make sure of transparency, that everything goes through a competitive process and not the good old boys way it was done historically in Pierce County. That's my assumption on why that was written in there. The other question that I do have, and it's mainly to Ryan and Lauren, is I would hope this isn't your first time that you've looked at contracting, procurement and processes. Have you implemented this anywhere else within a county or jurisdiction? This process that you're talking about and these suggestions?
Thank you. Yes. Process improvement is sort of our core business. I always say that our sort of three most frequent requests are procurement, permitting, and hiring. Those are the things that are sort of common to all local governments, sort of their frustrating processes. So yes, we have done similar work in a number of other areas.
Okay, and you've had obviously successes in suggesting these changes and the jurisdictions following through to cut timelines and to improve the process?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, and hopefully you can maybe give us a few of those jurisdictions that have gone through this process so we can learn from their experience. I do agree that I think Councilmember Denson did bring it up, is we need to make sure that when we do put out these RFPs, that they're very clear in the scope of what we're asking for. And I don't know if that's on us to make sure that we write in, whether it be proviso language or what we're attempting to do to make sure it's bright lighted as far as what we're asking out of these RFPs. And there's no real gray areas that happen. That's just my looking at it. Also, in trying to deal with the insurance requirements. I mean, that's always going to be a tough one because we obviously as a county have to be risk avert on everything, and we're dealing with mainly people in these type of RFPs and not just building a building or laying asphalt or putting gravel down. That there's a lot of risk out there that, risk management looks at, DPA looks at, and that we just have to make sure that there again, we're protecting the taxpayer's dollar and also being transparent in the process. So welcome to the private sector also in dealing with insurance. The state is very rabid in the way it deals with insurance, and the requirements are quite onerous. Obviously, once you figure out the system, it makes it easier. But for a new startup, it can be extremely challenging. So I would love to hear how that aspect of this goes with the insurance. And so with that, I could go on, but I'll let my other colleagues have a shot at this. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the questions and comments. We'll go to Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. My main focus too was on the insurance. As we know, across the country, insurance companies are pulling out of states, and I didn't know if this is something you might also want to take up with the Office of the Insurance Commissioner in some of the obstacles on that. And I was wondering if there were perhaps some examples of obstacles you have had with insurance in other arenas. It's one thing to put this plan together, which actually is very logical and makes sense, but then putting it into operation can be, is another aspect.
I will say, like, in my discussions with risk management about this, because I have the honor of looking at many contracts that come across the executive's desk for signature. And what you have in other purchases is kind of an industry standard, right? You know, you are doing a road project and you have to have X amount of money, X $1 million of coverage and this much retainage and this much, you know, reserve. And we can try to look at building something like that for human services and I would say like buckets. If you're dealing with, you know, children, you need to have at least this minimum, or if you're dealing with the elderly, you know, this minimum. Because as I understand it, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, is in some of the RFPs that I've looked at, as we've talked about, you will need to get insurance, but we're not giving an adequate information to say like what level it is. You know, we can't probably guarantee until we know the service that they're wanting to offer exactly what coverage they would need, but we can at least let them be on notice that it's going to be of a size and of a coverage area for that type of purchase. And I think risk management is, you know, they're very open to doing something like that. And maybe that's where we look at council generously provided $150,000 to implement some of these recommendations. And maybe that's where we can put some of them money, because I think it's really a people issue, is having someone being able to look at these types of contracts and maybe developing some of those minimums and working with the provider community so they understand that and help them understand where to access that kind of insurance. So it's a much more upfront request rather than in the contract phase, recognizing this is something you may need and have to go acquire.
Because I was running into the complications when we were working on the fireworks code, that there was the obstacle of the risk management had to look at certificates of insurance. And so the fix was giving them the ability to share in the system where they, instead of when you were talking about emailing, having to go back to the beginning and through everyone, that they were able to talk to each other and were able to eliminate that type of correspondence and get to the problem much quicker. And I don't know if maybe that's part of the system, but I'm wondering, are there like built-in flexibility? Because there are times when it's just so rigid, and maybe there's a slight modification that would make somebody who is very worthy of providing a service eligible versus having to battle something on the insurance. I don't know all the different parameters of that, but sometimes there's just not flexibility built in for some of the different nuances of those who are the providers. Let's see, is that? And I think you answered it in the presentation when you had the little stickers on the providers on areas that they deem most important that needed to be addressed. Were there some that didn't make a lot of sticky notes, but it ended up to be a very important point? Does anything come to mind? If not, it's no big deal, but.
You're asking if there were sort of major issues that were sort of significant in impact, even if they weren't people's main complaint?
I think part of it, there was a rather sizable paragraph of who participated of all the nonprofits or their service providers. And then when you had your sticky notes, you had your top selections. And were there any points made by some of the providers that were important, but only maybe affected only one or two put up there, but could have been important or that didn't get addressed? I don't know. It's difficult to ask that question. I'm like, because there were so many things that you covered.
Yeah, I mean, I could highlight maybe one or two other things, and Lauren, if you have thoughts too. I mean, one other thing we heard from a number of providers was about difficulty with their admin rate, feeling like they couldn't provide their overhead costs that they needed to provide with the county's current admin rate. We didn't focus on that as much in the presentation because it's maybe not as deep into the process per se as everything else. But it was something that we heard as a obstacle from a number of folks in the provider community. Lauren?
That's exactly the one I was going to bring up. Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the questions. And we'll go to Councilmember Ayala.
Thank you, Chair. First and foremost, thank you so much for doing all this work. I know it takes a long time, and I'm really glad that the process involved those that are being impacted by the procurement and RFP timeline. There's a couple questions that I have. I do want to surface related to the admin rate. I know that I personally have had many conversations with smaller organizations. And when I say smaller, I'm thinking like 1 million and below. Around that are admin rate percent and the impacts and implications of that, along with all the additional requirements. And so I'd love to follow up on that at a later date, not for today, but definitely something of interest. I do want to surface a couple of things, and many things have already been covered. But in terms of what the RFP process and reporting looks like, has there been any work or any investigation around how that can complement what's happening at the cities in order to reduce administrative burdens on our providers later on, or if we're just not there yet?
Well, I think it depends on, are we doing the same service? Because there are, if we're going to be consistent with another jurisdiction, I mean, we could do a review to see within their standard terms and clauses like insurance, length of term, some of the more generalized terms that, you have at the state or at the counties or at the cities. And I know that that's something that there was just like a recent state work group came out with a study about how to get some consistency. But when you're talking about, is there something we can take from the other jurisdictions where I think we have the biggest problem is really going to be, are we purchasing kind of the same service as them? And I think within the way we have tried not to duplicate service. So we're all kind of doing our piece. So it would be, it would be difficult to sort of copy from that, but I'm not saying there aren't things we can learn. So for example, in some of the RFPs that recently myself and Lee Beth Merrick had to look at, I did look at like, how's King County Regional Homeless Authority doing this? How has one of them a City of Tacoma? Because while to Councilmember Morell's point, despite the fact that they could do any process that they want, most do it by competition in some form in order to, be able to have, a wealth of ideas and a wealth of providers. And so I think there are ways we can learn to make it easier if we understand who they're doing business with. So can we be more alike with our peers? I don't know if we're there yet, because I think we're also just trying to figure out like what process do we need to have in Pierce County for this? But it's worth looking into, because I agree, if you can cut and paste and, not have to, redo the wheel. We can do that also a little bit better, I think, on our own, where if it's the same monies or the same service, it's like we don't have to look at this RFP as being like a brand new thing. It's what did we do in the past, or what have our peers done in other departments, where we can like learn and use tools that others have created.
Thank you. And then one more question. In terms of a risk pool and that being available to providers, are there any restrictions that we have to be very forthcoming about, whether it's providers that have supported funded organizations in the past, or maybe connecting a potential recipient of funds to someone who was funded before? Are there any restrictions on that end?
I'd have to do some research on that. I do know that there's a state law layer for the creation of like local government, local provider risk pools. because that was a part of the Office of Financial Management when I worked there. And so I don't necessarily think the county can build one for them, but they could themselves together. But I'd have to really look at that again, because the law could have changed in the last decade.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. I think for me, I had two questions. Do we as a county set the admin rate or is it set by the state?
Some of it depends, I do believe, on your fund source. And maybe some of the folks from Human Services who are more familiar can answer, but there are restrictions we get from, I know, state dollars, but if you're looking at your local dollars, I mean, I think that is something that we create on our own, but we want to be consistent if HUD has an admin cap or if the state has applied one. But it's certainly something to look into. And I mean, again, that state study just came out very recently, and it was also a component part of it. So we can take a look.
Yeah, it definitely was heard loud and clear with the state human services thing. And then the other part of this was creating a liaison role with the council. Was that someone designated from council staff is the liaison, or someone from the exec side or human services side is liaising with the council? I was trying to figure out what that role was.
I can start this, and then Lauren, if you want to add, the intention was that to be someone at Human Services, right? So rather than individual program managers from every Human Services program area needing to understand how to bring things to council and have the relationships with the council to do that well, kind of to consolidate that in sort of one person at Human Services who's going to sort of know how to run the legislative process well. Lauren, is there anything to add there?
I think only to add is that by having it be one person, you can start to develop relationships and better understanding of each other, but then they also know how to speak the language of the program managers. And so it'll help to just streamline that communication.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. I was prompted with another question, and you were explaining that there would be a look for a new system as opposed to the workday and expansion on that. And then with all of this, is there kind of a guesstimate on how this is affecting the size of our Human Services Department? Are we looking at a much bigger expansion or working within the same circle, or are we shrinking, or I don't think we're shrinking, but that could be mentioned at all. Is there any kind of a guesstimate? Are we increasing 5%, 10%, 20%? Maybe, 0, kind of remaining the same. Is there any kind of guesstimate on that projection?
No, I mean, I think that we've just gone on the assumption and we would do it within our current resources, what we can do. And then if there's something in addition to that, come back to council, and be able to articulate why, how much. But, I think as you already saw, we did, and this may be one that we bring back, is like we did hire Bonnie to help with procurements. And so to keep that probably long-term, we may need to fulfill, funding for that. But I think it's hard to say until we know what the system is how much is it, how much money do you need to support it?
Yeah, because just IT alone to do another program, that just rings dollar signs to me. I don't know about IT. It just seems that for other departments, when that has changed, it was.
And to me, it's all about choices. If the reason to get the new system is just to carve off 21 days, well, can we find other days elsewhere? If the cost or the change is too much, they're all, as you got to see that continuum of time is, they offer one solution, but there could be a different mix, and it may not be quite as short, but it may be, what we can afford.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the questions. I do want to invite any of our human services providers that took the time to really help us go through this work to give their reflections, and if there was one that rose to the top as far as suggestions that you're like, do this first. Like, I would love to hear any of your thoughts. And I don't know if someone from Human Services wants to kind of guide who might, or just stand up and come to the podium. I know Kate Ginn's in the audience, and I know there's a couple others, but I could say nose goes. That's what I used to do.
Thank you, Chair. Kate Ginn, I'm the Deputy Director of First Five Fundamentals. I participated as a community partner who has managed multiple contracts from the county. I think just as an observation, you know, I'm not in the weeds of a lot of the processes, but one thing that was really striking to me was seeing how many of the human services staff, based on different departments and funding sources, didn't know what the other one was doing and had that difference in processes for how they review. I know in another hat I wear as a member on the Birth to 25 Advisory Board, I've participated in reviewing RFPs for PASTA funds and would perhaps be interested or be willing to participate in other review committees, having now received that training, but the training appears to be different, whether it's homeless funds, PASTA funds, violence prevention funds. So I think having one pool of people you can tap into who are trained and ready to participate in a review process is one thing I think would be really helpful. I did want to mention in terms of insurance, I can only speak to looking at some state governmental contracts, county and city of Tacoma, but the county insurance requirements are significantly more than any of the other ones I have seen. Something that the county council could take action on that was not mentioned is that the county is also the only contract that requires us to participate in E-Verify, something that is duplicative and an administrative burden, duplicative of I-9 verification that's happening in human resource departments. And not a big deal for an organization like mine to do it for our staff, but we're required to pass that along to subcontractors, which in my case is childcare providers and other smaller agencies that have dozens of staff and have frequent turnover in staff. So having, as a contractor, passing along those requirements and making sure that they are fulfilling their requirements as well as the insurance requirements can actually become quite burdensome for us in fulfilling our contract requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any of my colleagues have questions for Ms. Ginn? Appreciate you spending the time, and I know it was a lot of time to do the work part of this. Anyone else that took the time to come sit through an hour-and-a-half long meeting would like to speak to the council? It's not a requirement. I just want to make sure you have opportunities, so.
Hello, my name is Taffy Wilden. I'm a program specialist in the Behavioral Health Division. And I just want to clarify this is the contract system that Mrs. Kruger was talking about, eliminating the 21 days. For human service staff, it's not about those days. It's about all the work that we do before we get put into Workday that we're manually tracking. We have numerous spreadsheets that we are tracking when we ask for insurance, when we receive the insurance. Is it missing a requirement? When did we contact that provider? We have no way to document the conversations that we've had. And then if somebody is gone or sick or leaves, we don't have any information besides that person's email to go back to. So we don't have a systemized repository within our own systems, let alone between my good partner, Patty, that we also work with, Kate. And so it becomes a triangulation when we all don't have the same sheet of music that we're playing from. Some of us are a little bit faster, some are a little bit slower. We miss keys here and there. So if the human service staff had a system that helped us know how to build the contract, know what needs to go in, every single component is a check mark. Our supervisors can see us working on those contracts. It reduces the amount of burden that we have to tell them where we're at and the updates that we're providing people, the communication we give to our teammates. Some of us have OAs that we're working with, and so we pass information on from one team member to the next. And if we had a system that we could share insurance, share E-Verify documents, share whether or not we had a performance improvement plan, what was in that performance improvement plan, what was our last fiscal risk audit. We want to communicate, and right now that's going on behind the scenes, and the staff are working very, very hard to reduce any burdens we can on the providers, and we cannot do that unless we have a system that works for us. So we, on behalf of human service staff, we implore you to please invest in a system to make our contracting simpler and streamlined, because it will benefit the providers greatly. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and I will see if anyone has questions.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thank you. Oh, Councilmember Denson.
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for speaking up because here we have no idea what's going on. We just know that it's taking way too long, but you've just outlined like, a major issue. It's something that we can address. So thank you for speaking up about that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I know one of the systems that came to light was the series that was required where one person signed off on something and then it went to the second person and went to the third person and they could never be doing it at the same time. And if somebody made a change 3 steps down, it went back to the first person and continued. So this system, if such a thing exists, and I guarantee somebody has made this because it's technology, but it's a system that would allow for those things to be checked at the same time. And if there were concerns, you would flag it and everybody would see, hey, there's an issue. And then the whole team comes together to huddle up or have the conversation about how to fix. So I think that seems like a really good investment in time and some funds too. So we can look to see how to make sure that we're really clear. But I think I would ask Ms. Murray and the Human Services Department to really see if there is a tool out there that exists that could help with that. And while 21 days might not seem like much as far as the contracting, the work in between and the communication between all the staff that touch this, I think if nothing else, for the sanity of them, really is worth that investment. So I would ask that we really look at that as one of the things we look to. So are there any other questions? I would just want to acknowledge and thank once again the Human Services staff. You took this very seriously and I know it was onerous and time consuming and sometimes emotional because there was frustrations on all sides. And thank you for taking it seriously and really working. And thank you to the team from I'm looking for a name, Partners in Public Innovation. So Ryan and Lauren and any of your other staff that supported you on this work, but really appreciate it. I think we are much better off. And I'll stop talking and see if Councilmember Ayala.
Thank you, Chair. Going back a few moments ago, I would say personally, my priority would be supporting providers to not dip into their own funds to supplement the time that it's taking us to give them the funds that provide service to our community. I know that is a huge burden and not everyone is able or can afford that. So for that reason alone, I would love to see this progress.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you all for being here and spending your afternoon. There's nothing else on the agenda. Is there any other business? Okay. Seeing no other business before us in study session, we are adjourned.
Bye.